Hello, beautiful community. You're very welcome to this tiny orientation about where we're at a week and a half, a week into the counteroffensive. And what we're going to do, I think, is say a little bit about how you actually negotiate the information bubble that you're in. And then we'll say a bit about our support for Ukraine, and then we'll say a little bit about an understanding of where Russia is at and whether any kind of catastrophic collapse or challenge can be expected on the Russian side politically that might change the situation. So as the battleground reality begins to diverge from some of the hyped expectations of the offensive that were generated in our sort of information bubble or in the related information bubbles. As that gap occurs, what we're going to see is people increasingly engaging in expressive politics. That's to say, picking out people who are pro-Ukraine but not pro-Ukraine enough and having a go at them or shaming them or exposing them. And even picking on people within one's own information bubble who are 98% in agreement, but that 2% is somehow off, and that 2% needs to be exposed. This is expressive politics because it's not effective politics, it doesn't achieve anything political, and it's identity politics because it constructs a certain identity around what it means to support Ukraine. And then builds out ways of engaging from that. One of the recent incidents we saw is an author withdrawing a book that, I don't know if it was any good or not, but it was fictionalizing 20th century Russian characters. And we're going to have a separate conversation about why that's a problem. Because what it does, actually, is insert Ukraine, or telling this woman to not publish her book en masse, is insert Ukraine on the losing side of a fleeting Western culture war. That is not going to help Ukraine in a 5 to 10 year term. And we've got to take that very, very seriously. And because so many folks who support Ukraine are either literary folks or journalistic folks or folks with a speciality in Eastern Europe, there isn't quite an understanding of exactly what one's doing when one's inserting the Ukraine narrative into this kind of, into these fleeting Western culture wars, especially doing that on the losing side. It's harmful. So what that woman did was harmful, and we'll have a long conversation about exactly why, because it absolutely makes a difference to how you yourself consume and engage, right? As you go about making sense of the world through the internet. Now, my suggestion is that it's very important to have a principle of care, which I think this community does a phenomenal job with, and a principle of political efficacy, right? How are we going to make, and how are we going to help Ukraine make that authoritarian, imperialist, quasi-mystical ghastliness emanating from the Kremlin, how are we going to make it lose? Next bit, Ukraine. The trouble is not just that we don't know what is happening on the battlefield without a great deal of opacity and delay in information passing through. The trouble is also sort of a wider historical challenge, namely we don't even know what segment of the conflict we are in, right? And I suggest that we're much more likely to be toward the beginning than the middle or the end, still. And we don't even know what shape that conflict has and how widely it will escalate. So it's very difficult to interpret what we're seeing. But my suggestion, as ever, is that Western citizens who understand the threat that Mr. Putin's regime poses, not just immediately to Ukraine, but also to our national interest, to our security interest in the West, right? That we build a picture around that, understanding that threat properly, that says we have a strategy that is, to a good extent, irrespective of what happens on the battlefield. The better Ukraine does, the better it's going to be. But we don't want our strategy, and this is the broken record, which I also came up with again on the main channel in the last video. We do not want our strategy to be dependent on what happens on the battlefield as much as it is at the moment. And so the kind of support that Ukraine requires for us, that is justified support because our national security interests are involved too, that kind of support should go beyond the outcome of the counteroffensive over the next weeks or months. And this really matters, and the West is divided about this. There is a party that says we're going to put Ukraine in a maximally advantageous position and then there can be negotiations. I'm very skeptical about that for all the reasons we've endlessly discussed. The other party says, no, we'll just keep putting Ukraine in a better and better position and we'll see what happens. That second approach is also reactive, actually, and not proactive, but it's much closer, at least, to what we need. Russia. What they have basically succeeded in doing is reformatting the propaganda picture successfully, such that this is now perceived as a war against the West and not a war against Ukraine, which funnily enough allows the Russians to get away with more defeats. At the beginning of the war, just in terms of my sense of what things were like on the ground, more Russian citizens who were open to supporting the war, being indifferent to the war, construed it as a war against the West than was reflected in Russian propaganda at the time. But now that has rather been rebalanced, and if anything, the propaganda is even ahead now of the population in Russia, arguing this is a big war against the West. And that's one respect, I think, in which the propaganda has ceased to be post-truth and has become, to a degree of about 20%, let's say, Soviet-style, alternate reality propaganda. And adjacent to that idea that this is a war against the West, they're trying to push the idea that this is a long-distance war. A war so long distance that we need to prepare the next generation for it. And I believe they are having limited success with that at the moment, and we're gonna have to see where that goes. The macroeconomic situation in Russia is surprisingly positive for now, and we have to admit that no economic collapse is on the cards in the near future, and that Russia is dramatically less economically isolated than one may have hoped. Putin is trying to freeze the war for now as much as possible, and Ukraine's going to make that difficult for him, so as to escalate later. This is a very difficult situation because that radical opposition to him in Russia wants to escalate now. And as a result, I think what we are going to see is a very strange balance of both deflationary and escalatory rhetoric. Escalatory rhetoric reflects where they, in the long range, in the long distance, want to go, and the deflationary language indicates where they are now, and hearing both. So, for example, only in the last week, we saw Putin saying, we have now maximally escalated. If we're going to escalate anymore, it's not going to happen anytime soon. Right? That's what Putin said to these Z bloggers when he met them. But at the same time, an article that was semi-outsourced by the Kremlin, and I've been asked to do a breakdown of it, so we might, sounded out a kind of millenarian message in which Russia starts World War III and hopes that it can get away with either scaring off the West before there is a full nuclear exchange, or indeed surviving a full nuclear exchange, and as it were clearing the ground, right? It's a kind of a millenarian before and after thinking that it is still part of what's going on in the Kremlin, that is very reminiscent of fundamentalist terrorism, whereby I say that to create a better tomorrow, I'm going to do a bloodbath today, but by some magic, today's bloodbath is somehow not going to impact tomorrow. That's of course, magical thinking. So that stuff is there, and casual talk about nuclear war that is not completely actually disconnected with, at least hypothetically engaging with nuclear war in different kind of what-if scenarios. That is there together with the deflationary language. So that's where we are. But what we got to think of is that Mr. Putin has lined himself against a very big alliance that outmatches him economically and militarily by a very long way. And if that alliance holds and manages to consolidate itself, then Mr. Putin will progressively be in a weak position. And one of the best things, of course, you can do at home is make sure your democracies hold and remain healthy. One of the most damaging things to Putin's chances in this war, and a good way of reducing his chances in this war over the next few months and years, is to secure your democracy from undue toxicity and undue polarization. That's a very, very hard task, but these two things are connected, and that's always going to be something we say for years to come, in fact, right? Imagine Ukraine's won this war and we're confident about its security. In years to come, we'll still be saying the same damn thing. If we secure our democracies, these democracies and their institutions are then going to be vehicles that will put us in the best or in the least worst place to face the major global challenges that are out there in the 21st century. Lots of love. Talk soon.